colleagues joining for our colleagues joining from the other side of the globe. Thank you all for joining our talk today. I'm Sabine Hatem. I'm a senior economist at the Institute of Finance, and I'm delighted to host today three prominent women who significantly contributed to their country's economic and policy development. We're very happy to have today with us Ms. Natalie Jaresko, the Executive Director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board of Puerto Rico and the former Minister of Finance of Ukraine between 2014 and 2016. Natalie has over 25 years of experience, including through many crisis periods in the public and private sectors. While she was Minister of Finance, she has led the successful negotiation and implementation of the largest IMF program in the institution history. And as a result, Ukraine enjoyed its first sign of economic recovery with the stabilization of domestic currency, growth in the banking system, reduced inflation, and growth in industrial production. And we look forward to hearing more about her experience. We're also very happy to have with us Ms. Yomna Khattab, the former Deputy Minister of Finance for Fiscal Policies in Egypt between 2018 and 2020. Yomna headed for more than 12 years the macro-fiscal policy unit at the Ministry of Finance of Egypt, and she had a leading role in the design and the rollout of the economic, financial, and social recovery program of Egypt. And we're also confident that we have a lot to learn from her experience as well. Last but not least, also very happy to have Alia Moubayed with us, the chief economist for the MENA region at Jefferies. Alia is an experienced economist, a policy practitioner, and a strategist with more than 25 years of experience in government, in international financial institutions and financial markets, and think tank, covering the Middle East, but also North Africa and other emerging markets. Alia is also quite familiar with the Lebanese case because she's Lebanese and because she started her career in the Lebanese public sector. And we're eager to hear from her on the lessons that Lebanon can draw from global experiences to chart its way forward and hopefully out of the crisis. So a warm welcome to the three of you, and thank you again for accepting our invitation. Just a few logistical arrangements before we start. We invite you all to write your question in the chat box anytime during the panel. We will allocate some time towards the middle and at the end for Q&A. And you can also, of course, use the raise hand icon to ask your questions. The session will be recorded and posted later on our website. In case we face some technical problems because of power cuts that are recurrent in Lebanon or because of the internet connection, and in case you're disconnected, please reconnect using the same link and the same credentials. I won't be very long, but I just a few words to put things in context for those who maybe might not be very familiar with the case of Lebanon. So for more than 18, almost for 20 months now, unfortunately, Lebanon has been in crisis, a crisis likely to rank in the top 10 and possibly top 3 most severe crisis episodes globally since the mid-19th century, as described by the World Bank. Decades of economic, financial, fiscal mismanagement, of state capture, and recurrent episodes of geopolitical and internal conflicts have brought the country to its knees. Debt to GDP ratio reached 190% prior to default. Lebanon defaulted on its debt in March 2020, and the fiscal deficit peaked at 17% of GDP last year. Today, Lebanon is faced with rapid and continued currency depreciation, multiple exchange rates, hyperinflation, the depletion of its foreign currency reserve, banking sector impairment, twin deficits, and very high quasi-fiscal deficits. The livelihood of millions of people is being destroyed. Today, 77% of households say they do not have enough food to put on the table every day, according to the latest numbers and indicators released by the UNICEF. Public service and institutions are on the brink of collapse. But Lebanon is mostly suffering from policy inaction. In April 2020, and though the government proposed a recovery plan that aimed to backstop the recession over a 5-year period of time, it proposed measures that include to stabilize the currency, to distribute the losses through debt and financial sector restructuring, to embark on a medium-term fiscal consolidation plan, to strengthen social safety net, and to negotiate an international rescue package, notably an IMF program. However, and despite all these measures proposed, the plan lacked a strong fiscal adjustment plan that would provide a clear overarching framework and bold reform measures. In addition, the plan was never endorsed by the parliament. Amid political discord, talks with the IMF were suspended as of May 2020. Today, policy inaction is delaying very critical economic, financial, and governance long-due reforms, and it's fueling the gradual collapse of the economy amid worsening fiscal and social conditions. Ukraine and Egypt have faced in the recent past similar episodes of crisis, maybe in some of the aspects, maybe not of the all aspects we're facing in Lebanon, but they have put in place bold recovery program, both backed up by the IMF. Today, we are here to listen and to learn from their experiences with the particular focus on the fiscal aspects of intervention. So how did Ukraine and Egypt gear their fiscal policies and institutions to respond to the crisis, and what can Lebanon learn from their experience? To start listening more and getting to learn more about those experiences, I will turn to Natalie and with my first question. And Natalie, in 2014, the IMF approved a $7 billion program to support Ukraine economic reform program. And this program came as Ukraine was experiencing its second major economic crisis in 6 years, marked by an overvalued exchange rate, a loose fiscal policy, sizable losses in the state-owned enterprise that is the Naftogaz, large twin deficits, a rising debt, and depletion of international reserves. As Minister of Finance at the time, what was the fiscal policy response? What were the fiscal instruments that you put in place? What types of challenges did you face? And how did you design this fiscal response? I mean, was it more of a top-down approach, more participatory? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Thank you very much. It's a true honor to be here with such strong female successful leaders. And so thank you for this opportunity. Ukraine did suffer from a very severe shock in 2014. We were coming out of what we call the Revolution of Dignity in early 2014. We were surprised by the invasion and occupation of Crimea, and then later that year, the occupation of Eastern Ukraine. So 7% of the territory was occupied, but that resulted in a decline of 20% of the GDP had been captured. So it was a true crisis of both economic, strategic, and physical proportions. And by the time I came into government, I was the second finance minister post-revolution. So the first government had already negotiated an initial IMF package, which was insufficient for the crisis that was evolving. As you said, we suffered currency devaluation, depleted foreign reserves, banking crises, massive capital outflows, extremely high inflation, a massive balance of payments gap. Our fiscal deficit was over 10% of GDP. And as you can imagine, trade with our largest partner, Russia, had completely stopped. By the time I was appointed in December of 2014, frankly speaking, there was no choice but to devise a program. And we were talking about this earlier. At that moment in crisis, there was political unity amongst all parties to identify a solution. And that solution, everyone at that moment understood, had to include the IMF, the G7, and the World Bank and other international institutions, because we alone were going to be unable, just unable, not resource-wise, not policy-wise, unable to survive that crisis. Again, a new front had been established in the East. And it became clear as finance minister that not only did I have the problems that had been inherited as a result of, frankly speaking, decades of poor economic performance and policy, but also we now needed to finance a war. And it required difficult, unpopular decisions. It was, Sabine, a top-down approach. In the beginning, it was a top-down approach where we married monetary reform, monetary policy with banking reform to try and stabilize the financial situation, together with fiscal reform. And that fiscal reform was very much expenditure driven, consolidation of expenditures, although we started to focus on revenues a bit later. It required, so I think you mentioned something about the Lebanese parliament not buying into the reforms. In our case, we needed to have all the different political players, the president, the prime minister, who represented different parties, the opposition as well in the parliament, to come together, because frankly speaking, we were at the edge of a cliff. At least that's how I felt when I was minister. Had we not acted in a serious, deep and coordinated fashion, the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, as well as the government overall, we would not be able to cope with what was happening. And the people in the country could not cope with what was happening. And I think that that united political will, which frankly speaking was fleeting, and I urge everyone to use your crisis, because as soon as you feel any sense of stability, that political will starts to dissipate. So you need to do as much as you humanly can, as quickly as you humanly can. My single regret as minister is that I slept. I wish I had worked 24 hours a day the entire 16 months. I think for us, what was critical was very close coordination, not only within our government, as I said at the beginning, in a top-down fashion, but also with those international players, because they gave many of us who were reformers, especially as patience for the reformers started to wane, it gave us that support mechanism so that we could unite what we were doing with some support mechanisms for the people. So as an example, when you're doing education consolidation, closing schools that are empty because of demographic trends and changes, one of the key things for me in closing the schools, no parent likes to hear that their child's school has been closed and they have to go on a bus somewhere further. But if you can establish hub schools, for example, that are better than the school the child left, and you can inspire the parents with the fact that not only are you closing the school, but you're opening something of greater value for them. And we did that with the support of that G7, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and other groups. And so pairing the difficult reforms with something that supported the population, where people could have renewed confidence, renewed hope, renewed optimism after, as I said, a very difficult experience and decades of poor governance. I think from my perspective, what we were able to do, focusing on expenditures, number one, we needed to reduce the deficit by reducing the size of government, making it leaner, more efficient, using technology to the extent humanly possible in procurement in particular, both saved money, but also enabled us to bring small business into the purchasing and to break down some of the walls that the vested interests had built to control procurement. We eliminated much of the demand on government to subsidize gas prices. In our case, we had a public monopoly, Naftagaz, that was driving a large, significant portion of that combined government deficit. And moving Naftagaz to being a net provider of taxes today was a huge change, but it required raising gas prices on the population. In some cases, 67% for heating, 285% for gas overall. That increase had to be married with social assistance programs for those who were truly in need. But convincing the population that we should be subsidizing only those in need and not those who could afford to pay the market price of gas was a major, major reform program that required everyone to come together, because it was a shock after decades of subsidized gas prices. But only in that way were we able to then restructure that public monopoly, reduce the demand of that public monopoly for subsidies, and instead deliver subsidies to those truly in need. Those types of expenditure movements, reducing public spending by reducing public servants, I think our target was about 3% of public servants had to be reduced. And then reducing the drain from the public monopoly on the gas, instead turning to means-tested subsidies. And then looking at revenue measures, secondarily, revenue measures, primarily not to increase taxes per se, but to make the tax system more equitable. And when I say that, seriously, what you're looking at is where the vested interests have, in essence, used the tax system to benefit themselves, which is terribly unfair to the others. And so looking at where oligopolies and monopolies had defined preferential situations, whether it was in royalties, in rents for natural resources, whether it was in elimination of the value-added tax for agricultural business, all of that were things that we tackled. And in that way, we built some groundwell of support. So I'll finish with this, Sabina. It started top down, but over the process, we brought in a great deal of civil society and the ideas that they had for tax reform, the ideas that they had for social assistance. It wasn't always that we were aligned fully in those reform efforts, but before I left 16 months later, there was a very integral bottoms up approach to the reforms and feedback and criticism and debate. And so I think that that created a much stronger reform platform going forward.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. I think we relate in the problems. we're not yet at implementing the solutions here in Lebanon, but thank you very much for the overview. We'll go back to many of the things you mentioned, I think, in the question part. I'll move on to listen a bit also to Yomna. Yomna, since 2011, underlying structural challenges and the political transition in Egypt led to the build-up of macroeconomic imbalances, including also an overvalued exchange rate, a depleted reserve, high subsidies, and a growing public sector wage bill, and a growing public debt. This led by the end of 2016 for the IOF to approve a $12 billion program for Egypt. So can you tell us a bit more about the program? Also, what types of instruments were put in place to face the crisis? Were you able to reach the fiscal objective you had set for yourself at the time? We're eager to listen to you and to the case of Egypt as well.
Thank you, Sabine, so much. And I'm really glad as well to be among all of you talking about the Egyptian experience. So let me first share with you some slides so we can maybe visualize the Egypt Economic Reform Program while I'm giving you an overview. Could you please disable the screen sharing for me?
Yes, just a minute, please.
Sure.
I disabled it. Can you try to share?
Yes, it's working now.
It's working.
So So the Egypt Reform Economic and Stabilization Program, we had lots of ingredients for a typical financial and economic crisis. Starting 2011, since 2015, we had augmented political instability due to several disturbances on the political side. Also, we had a very short period of interrupted and incomplete reforms with different governments, a very delayed structural reforms. We didn't invent the wheel. We knew what kind of structural reforms we needed to be implemented. However, this structural reform plan was actually delayed several times. And of course, we had a lack of integrated and modern inclusive policies. So structural and macroeconomic imbalances, loss of competitiveness were direct consequences of these strong policies, and of course delay of reforms and instability. We can see that real GDP growth has declined since compared even to the period from 2005 to 2010. Also, the total deficit, the overall deficit of the budget has increased dramatically, in 2014-2015, total debt exceeded actually 100% in 15-16. So it was the time to have a pause and started a homegrown reform economic program that promotes mainly to inclusive growth and job creation. We had a primary objective, which is the growth and job creation. We had the social protection component, just as Natalie mentioned. The two components beside each other are very important in an inclusive economic reform program. And we had actually several tools that we tried hard in Egypt to use in a gradual way. The monetary, of course, policy, prices, exchange rate. We had the fiscal consolidation, which actually was the main focus, especially at the beginning of the program. Then we moved to the structure reform agenda that we're going to see as we move forward. The reform program in Egypt had three key pillars. The first of all is the macroeconomic stability, the structure reforms agenda, and the social inclusion component and pillar of the program. Of course, the IMF were on board right after drafting this homegrown reform program, and their support, their technical assistance, the negotiations we had with them also give a huge push to move forward with the program. What were the key reform measures that we undertook under this program? As you may see, during the two first years of the program, 2016 to 2017, we had a front-loaded reform agenda. All these boxes actually represent lots of reforms on different fronts actually. We had lots of reform in the tax area, specifically the introduction of the VAT. That was a major reform that we have tried for several years to introduce, but never succeeded. So that was one of the major and the very first reforms that we had on the tax side. Also, a new civil service law to manage the huge wage bill that we have been suffering from, the fuel and electricity subsidy reforms. That was a very important one. We started actually in 2016, but we had it over different phases, over almost 5 years. The last phase of the fuel subsidy reforms, we had it few months back, and of course the flotation of the Egyptian pound. The structure reform and business environment, that had an equal focus also from the government. We had a new industrial and licenses law, new investment law. We had also expert promotion scheme. The small business taxation regime took also a special focus also from the government. We can see also a feed-in tariff, public transportation reform agenda, and procurement law as well. How did this go? It went very well actually, and we're going to see by figures how the Egyptian government succeeded actually to start its recovery phase. We had a macroeconomic recovery and resilient growth path. The real GDP growth, as you can see, increased from 4.4 to 6.4. The unemployment rate has decreased to one digit actually by starting 17-18. Also, the overall deficit has decreased from around 13% in 2013 to almost 8% in 1920. The primary balance shifted from a deficit, a very persistent deficit actually, to a surplus starting 18-19. And of course, the total budget sector debt, which was huge concern to the Egyptian government, it decreased from the more than 100% that we reached in 16-17 to around 87-85% of GDP by the end year of the group. So I'll stop here and waiting for all other questions in the coming.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we'll go back. Thank you for the overview, and we'll go back to maybe specific parts of what you mentioned later in the discussion. I'd like now to turn to Alia and ask her a little bit, what are the first lessons that Lebanon can draw out of the experiences of the two countries we've listened to, Ukraine and Egypt? You're muted, Alia.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Sabine and the IOF team. It's a great pleasure to be.
بشتغل بدك شو يعني بدك أنا أقوم وأحط يعني فرقتك صحتين ضبية.
Sorry. And it gives me great pleasure to be with both Yomna and Yomna to really reflect on their experiences and see how we can benefit from it. I'm obviously more familiar with the Egyptian case, given my work focus, but I have also been very struck by a lot of both similarities that the Ukraine case brings to Lebanon, given both the nature of the problems, but also the other elements related to the political economy and geopolitical considerations that sometimes impact the efforts and the effectiveness of policies in a given context. But let me start by saying that first, I think share similarities but also differences with both countries. I think it's important to highlight that the Lebanon case is similar in terms of the large unsustainable deficits, particularly fiscal deficits that have led or have led to the crisis, but also a legacy of economic mismanagement, like as was said in the case of Ukraine, that also characterized the situation in Lebanon for the last 2 or 3 decades. And at the heart of which lies essentially an important element, which is a poor governance. But at the same time, we need to recognize that there are differences as we think about these lessons. I think in the Lebanese case, we have a situation where the crisis is a multidimensional crisis. It's both a debt and a banking and a balance of payment crisis that rapidly evolved into a political and social crisis. But at the same time, I think a major difference that Lebanon's case has is that we have, unlike Ukraine and Egypt, have had huge losses in our financial sector due to large quasi-fiscal operations done by the central bank and to the tune of almost losses of almost 100% of GDP, and that will shape both the evolution of the crisis, but also the response towards it, at the heart of which is the fiscal response. Also, a major difference, I think, between Lebanon and those countries is Lebanon's very weak state institution. Unlike Ukraine and Egypt, the state in both, and what I mean by the state is also the administration, has an important role. There's a system of centralized planning, and notwithstanding, of course, the political crisis and protest movements that preceded the Ukrainian crisis, but the state in Ukraine is strong despite everything, unlike in Lebanon. So from that point of view, I think there are important lessons for us, having heard what our colleagues said. And I can, and I'll summarize them in few lessons. The first, in my view, is what both countries said, is that as much as there was an importance for immediate macro stabilization effort, both on the monetary and on the fiscal side, but these stabilization policies needed to go hand in hand with a broad and deep structural reform agenda in order to form the basis for a strong and sustainable economic growth that could underpin the path to that sustainability, but also to mitigate the impact of fiscal consolidation and also ensure that growth recovery is underway. And I think this is something extremely important as we think about our next stage, whenever we have a government that is able to revive a plan in Lebanon, is that we should not only focus on the macro stabilization, but anchor it into a broader set of structural reforms that should presage the kind of economic and model, and also I would say the social contract that we need for the future, given the fact that the current existing model that we are living through which the crisis is unfolding is clearly a model that cannot be sustained. So this parallelism and this coherence and between the fiscal stabilization and the structural reform agenda is necessary. The second, I think, lesson is the commitment to the deep and decisive, I think, reforms in the energy sector, which in both countries, and maybe more in the case of Ukraine, was a macro-critical sector for the success of the fiscal reform agenda. And this is also the case in Lebanon, where losses imposed or generated by our electricity company and the mismanagement of the sector, the corruption in it, the inability to move towards cost recovery has actually been a major driver of debt and of deficits. So the focus as a priority on the reform of the energy sector is also something we can learn, and we can clearly see that, as the Ukraine case has showed us, is that a successful reform of the energy sector through phased subsidies, tariff recovery, etc., was important to create enough savings in order to reallocate the fiscal savings and the fiscal space to other much needed reform. And that brings me to the third lesson learned, which is the necessity to pair those difficult and unpopular and painful reform with a very strong view on how to mitigate the impact of these fiscal reforms by utilizing the newly created fiscal space in order to set up very effective and well-targeted social safety nets, while at the same time reforming the social sector, because if I understand also, Ukraine has done fundamental transformations at the sector level in education and health, like we've just heard, closing the number of schools, etc. So there were fundamental social reforms that not only needed to enlarge the social safety net to mitigate the impact of subsidy reform and higher utility prices, but at the same time redesign both the wage bill in some of the social sector, but also the effectiveness of the use of the social infrastructure. The fourth lesson also that we can learn from what I heard is that political economy considerations matter a lot, and in particular in the case of Ukraine. And this is very close to home in Lebanon, where for the last 20 months, it is exactly political economy consideration, i.e. Power balance within society, very strong interests, vested interests that have thwarted the implementation of the financial rescue plan of the caretaker government, have been really obstructing any movement towards a path of exit from the crisis in Lebanon. And the reason why is that we were not able to achieve that unity that Yomna spoke about when both designing and seeking ownership for these reforms. I think if there is one lesson to learn from Lebanon's crisis and policy inaction over the last 20 months is this need to ensure that all stakeholders are on board in the design and the discussion of the rescue plan. The sixth and maybe last lesson, and I'm sure there are other we can learn from in the case of Lebanon, is really also this importance of lining up and engaging in a smart and well-crafted manner with the international community, particularly when both fiscal and external financing needs are necessary. I think in both countries, both in Egypt and in Ukraine, the authorities have gone with their draft plan not only to the IMF but also to the bilaterals because of the large fiscal financing needs that could not possibly only be supported by the IMF. And there was a strategic approach to ensuring that the contribution of each and every donor to the financing package was aligned to the fiscal reform objectives, whether in terms of funding social safety nets or supporting technical assistance or even funding the external financing needs, particularly in the case of Egypt and Ukraine, involving regional countries like in the GCC, but also in the case of Ukraine, the European Commission and other countries. So I think there's a lot that we can learn, both on the design of the components of the fiscal package, the need for progressivity in tax reform, for example, as we heard in Ukraine, because fundamentally in Lebanon, a key problem in our fiscal system that led to the crisis is a deep inequity in society that was fed by the absence of a fiscal policy and of a tax policy that soundly helped to have an equitable distribution of income in society. And I think we can learn a lot from not only the reforms on the expenditure side through subsidy and the wage bill, but also on the revenue side by designing a better and more equitable progressive income tax that Ukraine in particular has tried to implement. I'll stop here, but obviously we can discuss more. And I hope maybe, if I may, one thing that we would be very interested to learn from Ukraine is about the debt restructuring plan of Ukraine and the approach to debt restructuring, which is one of the most unusual but also eclectic way of using GDP warrants to the bonds, or having a smart strategy for discussing with creditors. And I hope we can, in the discussion, have more comments from our Ukrainian colleague on this particular issue that is of relevance in Lebanon today.
Thank you, Alia. Natalie, would you like to inform us a little bit about how the debt restructuring took place? And after that, I will take a few questions from the chat room.
Of course, thank you very much. The debt restructuring was a critical part of the stabilization. We were facing an imminent default, and we did not believe that the economy could take it, that we would be able to get through a default without the banking system, which was already under enormous stress and collapsing because of poor regulation, poor governance. What would have happened in a default situation would have affected every single person, the currency and all else. And so we worked very hard to, with the IMF, to define the parameters of a debt restructuring. This came to a large extent because the balance of payments gap was so large that no single party, as I think Alia was mentioning earlier, no single party wanted to be the one that satisfied that balance of payments gap. So if there was a $40 billion balance of payments gap, the IMF took on satisfying, let's say with this program, 17.5 billion of it. But we needed to seek private sector support, that was the debt restructuring, to achieve a $15 billion part of that gap. And then the remaining $7.2 billion was going to be satisfied by support from other international institutions, World Bank, or bilaterally, United States, Japan, G7. So we were responsible in this debt restructuring for achieving a $15 billion savings between 2015 and 2018. The actual parameters of that debt restructuring were very much defined in the IMF program. And to be perfectly frank, that's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that we knew what our objectives were, but it was bad because so did the creditors. And so as I now lead a municipal bank, a municipal debt restructuring in Puerto Rico, I feel a little bit more freedom in defining my objectives because I don't have an IMF document that's public that says you must generate 15 billion in public sector financing. You must reduce your public debt ratio to under 71% by 2020. You must keep your budget gross financing needs at an average of 10% of GDP from 2019 to 2025. So because that was all defined in the IMF document, all the creditors knew what we had to achieve. It was impossible in that respect to achieve more because there was no leverage at that point. They knew that if we achieved those three objectives, that we would be able to maintain our IMF program and all of the other international support. So we did achieve those three, but we did it in a very limited perimeter, of debt. And what I wanted to be clear about, and I think Alia, you mentioned that the Lebanese banks held some of the Lebanese debt previously. When we were doing this debt restructuring, we chose to only deal with our London Club debt. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One, we could not restructure our domestic debt, again, without further harming and weakening the local banking institutions. So the domestic debt and domestically denominated debt all stayed unrestructured. Similarly, we never touched our Paris Club or sovereign debt. A big part of the reason there was, you can't look at the gift horse in the mouth. We were looking to the international public community to support us in these reforms. We couldn't go and try and haircut the debt outstanding. In addition, Ukraine had not a substantial amount of remaining public debt at the Paris Club. So all of the debt restructuring had to happen in the London Club, in the sovereign debt that was commercially held. We, as I said, had this difficulty in trying to get more done. And what we faced with creditors, which probably is not unique, and I face it today in Puerto Rico as well, is creditors believe you have a liquidity problem and you believe you have a solvency problem. And that debate, should we just reprofile and string it out over an incremental 40 years? You can afford it. We'll just wait. Creditors are willing to wait. We'll just give you more debt. We'll give you more debt to refinance this debt and you'll be fine. Where you as a finance minister believe, no, we have a solvency problem. We cannot afford this debt. We cannot afford more debt. We need to reduce the amount of debt. And that debate, liquidity versus solvency, really is at the key. And that's how the warrants or the upside instruments or the contingent value instrument, the GDP warrants in this case, arise. You can debate liquidity and solvency forever, and you will never agree that I believe my country will not be able to afford this amount of debt, period. We will not recover sufficiently. And even if we do, that's not where I want to use those minimal revenues that I have. I have other equally, if not more important needs. And so what the GDP warrant does, what the contingent value instrument provides, is you reach your objectives defined in your IMF program. And if the economy outperforms, then you will repay creditors more. And rather than debating that, potentially defaulting, potentially having all the negative reaction to the economy and the population, we agreed this is what we believe we can afford today. And if the situation is much better, if GDP grows above and beyond whatever the parameters are, 3%, 4%, we will pay incrementally more. But if we do not have that upside, if we do not have that economic performance, outperformance, we will only pay what we think is affordable. And in fact, for the first time in history, in US history, we're doing this as well in Puerto Rico. Not linked to GDP in this case, linked to a particular revenue source, but in the same way, saying, we believe it's a solvency problem. We can only afford to pay X. And the creditor's saying, no, it's a liquidity. Everything will be better. You'll be able to afford to pay us more. And the contingent value instrument provides them more if and when economic outperformance exists.
Thank you, Natalie. Very, very, very interesting. I'll go to the chat room, and the first question was also to you, Natalie. What were the main by Amal Karaki? What were the main obstacles to the reform in Ukraine, to the transformational process? And did you feel any time that the process could fail?
Every day. You feel every day that the process can fail. Every day you're hanging on for every part of your reform process. You are struggling because of weak institutions, meaning as well a weak civil service, not one that is well paid, well motivated, all of that weak governance, but also one that is very much controlled by vested interests. And vested interests at some point feel attacked because you are removing some of their interests. You are eliminating some of those inequities through the revenue policies. And each day you feel that the weak institutions, the vested interests, of course, we were at war, the cost and the focus that is demanded by war of defending yourself moves the focus away from reform. So every day, those issues challenged whether or not we would be able to complete, continue, expand the reforms. And I think, touching on Yomna's point, in our case, I think where we struggled at the end was not in the monetary fiscal area, but it was in the structural reforms. Those longer term structural reforms that require longer commitment, much deeper commitment to changing the nature of the economy and elimination of vested interest pockets. That's where, in the end, the political will just was insufficient. We stabilized the monetary system and the fiscal system, but today Ukraine has 3 to 4% growth, not sufficient to pull the economy out of its poverty, the population out of poverty. Not bad compared to 8 or 6% declines in GDP. Of course, we're past the crisis, but not enough growth. We're not able to overcome the lack of rule of law, the corruption, and the vested interests that control those things or direct them, and then in that respect not attract the level of investment to really put the fuel on growth.
Another question to Alia. So I'm reading. You mentioned the importance of getting all parties in Lebanon to agree on the reform program. Are you optimistic that this can be achieved in the foreseeable future with the existing political setup? And what are the actionable steps you would suggest to achieve this?
Yeah, obviously this is the toughest, I think, component or aspect of Lebanon's path towards reform, which is really trying to build consensus when there are so many fault lines across society. But I think what you need, one reason I think why we didn't manage to get a lot of consensus is also, as I mentioned, is because we were not able to understand very well the drivers, the political economy drivers of making in Lebanon, or what could impact, or what could obstruct reform, and what could be the catalyst, and design our program in a way that can create as much as possible, I don't say win-win situation, but have a national dialogue that explains that the losses that the economy is facing are so big that the only way for moving forward is for an equitable distribution of the losses, not as we have been seeing for the last 20 months. And that eventually an equitable distribution with a solid program anchored in a broader consensus can reduce the reversibility of these reforms in the future. I think it's not a question of optimism or not. I think we have to make an effort in Lebanon to move towards increasingly more evidence-based policy discussions. And a lot of what institutions like the Institute of Finance is doing, and build that culture in society. Because as I think Natalie said, I think when you want to do a top-down proposal of reform, you want to and engage civil society and the layman really to explain things in a very accessible manner. And create the incentive for both individuals, enterprises to buy into these reforms. And I think it is both a responsibility of the policymakers to do that, but also a responsibility of the wider net of stakeholders to be open and ready for this kind of discussions in order to contain the unfolding crisis. At some point, each one has to make concessions.
Thank you, Alia. Moving to Yomna, there's also a question from the chat. What type of social safety nets were put in place to support the most vulnerable groups, and how were these nets financed in Egypt?
Actually, that was the major the major question that we had at the beginning of drafting and designing the reform program. And of course, the ultimate goal is to foster growth, decrease unemployment, and create more jobs, and alleviate poverty. However, on the short term, the very short term, all the reforms specifically related to subsidies, energy subsidies, had lots of negative impact on the most vulnerable groups. So putting into place short-term policies to protect these vulnerable groups was actually a priority in the reform program. What we have been doing is to introduce and expand the already existing social programs that were in place, and introduce new social programs targeting specific categories. So targeting women who were in charge of their households, targeting elders who were already retired. Some welfare packages at the beginning of each budget year were also introduced to increase, give some additional bonuses from 10 to 15% for wages, for pensions, and introducing new programs. The most very well-known one is the Takaful and Karama. This is a very well-known program that had succeeded in Egypt during very few years while implementing the reform program. How this had been financed, the major thing actually was to restructure the subsidy scheme in Egypt. So a huge part of the financing of these social protection programs, the new ones and the expansion of the already existing ones, coming from the savings that were made on the energy subsidies, specifically the energy subsidies, electricity and fuel. That was the main source of financing, is to reallocate the savings that were made on the budget from the fuel subsidies reform to finance other social protection programs.
Okay, thank you. A question to Natalie, also from the chat, is about, you mentioned that you put in place some platform to engage more with civil society organization. So there's also a question from the chat asking if you could provide us with a bit of further details on how the engagement with civil society was put in place.
Thank you. It really was multi-level. It to a large extent, post our revolution of dignity, civil society self-organized, and I think that's very important. They organized around different themes. So we had just a general reform organization that's called the Packet of Reforms that kept proposing things they thought needed to be done. Others organized around specific themes like tax, still others around environmental change. So there was a great deal of groundswell of civil society self-organizing to engage and to insert itself into policymaking. Because Ukraine had during the Soviet Union, of course, but during its 20, 30 years of independence, always had top-down policy. This was civil society's reaction to to engaging. We did do government-inspired integration with civil society. And in particular, at the Ministry of Finance, we created a platform called Open Data, Open Budget. And by putting all of our budget and data online and making it transparent and very, very usable, we created a system where people could create their own cabinets, we call it, and they would in that cabinet manipulate and use the data and try and figure things out. It engaged people at every level of society. And as that open budget, open data system grew all the way down to the municipal level, and for the first time, residents in a town could actually question how monies were being used in their local town budget. They could see how much was being used on fixing roads versus, purchasing new cars for the mayor and his entourage, his or her entourage. And that enabled them to then speak to those choices. And that was hugely important in creating a permanent, what I believe, a permanent civil society link to how monies are being spent. And then finally, we made every effort to engage, again, with civil society. Even when we were proposing a major tax reform, my deputy minister for tax policy went from town to town, region to region, holding open forums, debates, taking input. We had a real back and forth. It doesn't mean, of course, that you accept everything that's proposed, but there was a very, very large and groundswell of debate over what that tax reform should look like, how it would affect average citizens, average businesses, not just in the parliament, which could represent, a very select portion of society, but down at that groundswell. So it was self-organized. We then created tools to even further develop that civil society, and then we engaged with them.
Thank you. Well, in Lebanon, we're trying to work on improving fiscal transparency, but we're facing a bit of resistance and some other technical challenges related to actually the lack of available data. Yes, please go ahead.
I think sometimes you need to put up data even if it's not correct. You need to put all the footnotes, but you need to start putting up the data. And the second thing I'd say is, and I've experienced this in Puerto Rico as well, even when political will for reform recedes, it's very hard to back off of the transparency. So the more transparency you can create, the more you can put public data forward, even if it's of questionable accuracy sometimes. That is a permanent situation, which is very hard to back away from for future governments, even if they don't have the political will to reform. It's hard to say, you know, we've been transparent about all of our bank accounts for the last 5 years, but we're going to take it down now. So I really believe that transparency is kind of one of the most permanent parts of reform that you can create.
Yeah, very useful advice. Thank you. And please, I would also, if anyone has a question that you would like to engage directly with the speakers, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or to write in the chat, and I can read the question. Yomna, I have a question. I have a question for you regarding the capacity at the Ministry of Finance. Did you feel that you had to, you know, to enhance, to consolidate more the human capacity and technical capacity that was at the Ministry of Finance when you started with the program implementation? Did you need new skills? I mean, or did you feel that the skills were already there and it was enough? I mean, for the ministry to conduct such, you know, a wide response program.
Actually, the capacity building at the Ministry of Finance, it was something that has been invested in few years before the program. However, after the program, it was very important to tackle specific kind of trainings that would help the employees at the Ministry of Finance and at the tax authority specifically to implement the reforms that were part of the program. For example, one of the major components of the reform is to start the program-based budgeting, for example. So this is something very new to people working in the budget department, and it was and they have all the experience, they have all the data. They don't need someone from outside to come and do the program-based budgeting. All they need is to have some specific training and capacity building in this specific area. Of course, international organizations played a huge role in this field. We had the IMF, we had sometimes the World Bank sending experts to have some capacity building and trainings in these specific areas. Of course, consultants from peer countries had its huge impact on the people to receive the information, to relate to other countries' experiences. So for example, having an expert from like South Africa telling us the experience of South Africa and how they actually started to implement program-based budgeting had an impact in the communication and how people receive the information, and they are not resistant to learn new skills so they can implement the reforms in the program.
Thank you. So another question from the chat to Natalie, and another one to Alia after that. Natalie, do you think that economic science is enough for solutions, or that it should start at the social and cultural level? There's more above, but I mean, is the question clear, or should I elaborate a bit more?
I think I understand. I saw it in the chat. I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I don't know that you get to choose one or the other, and you don't get to order things in that way. I think you have to tackle all of it simultaneously. And I mean, if I had a choice to go back in history, because I was in Ukraine when it first became independent, I would have focused everything on rule of law and anti-corruption. But that was not what happened. And so the vested interests took hold, and breaking that is very hard. So when you think about even the capacity building that Yomna just talked about in Egypt, you know, to a large extent, government pay is very poor, and to a large extent that may be purposeful, because you know, if you were to better train and raise government pay, then they may not be as susceptible to vested interests and to corruption. And so there's an interplay here that's very hard to break. Reducing the size of government is the first step in order to then increase the civil service pay, do the training, create the systems. Which thing comes first, second, or third? Well, without fiscal consolidation, we don't have this fiscal space to pay more. And so it's very hard to choose. It's almost as if you have to build a web of these changes over time. I also want to say that in Ukraine, we had been through 3 revolutions in 20 years or so. And so, the social groundswell for an end to corruption was very clear after that third revolution. I think the challenge was, could government move fast enough to satisfy the demands of society? And I think Ukraine hasn't done that yet. And so, they need to move faster on the rule of law and the anti-corruption. And only that will then allow those structural reforms to succeed. And so it's all interwoven, and I don't know how you pick what comes first, second, or third. I think it's important to acknowledge that one cannot succeed without the other, that you have to make progress in all, or all progress will be withheld.
A question to Alia. I think you tackled a bit on that, but just to summarize again, what do you think is required from Lebanon today to put in place, based on everything that was discussed, to put in place a fiscal roadmap to start getting out of the crisis, maybe to what we call now rebuild the country back better?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that we are asking ourselves every day as the situation keeps deteriorating. So your menu of option is not necessarily the same as your margin of maneuver for policy maneuver gets thinner and thinner. But I think this is where the first step is really to make sure that as you are designing this reform plan to really have a very good understanding of the new context that is evolving in Lebanon very fast because of the mass impoverishment of the population and the significant deleveraging we are seeing in the banking sector and some in the private sector, the fact that this forced brutal adjustment that happened has actually allowed us to significantly shrink our external financing needs from maybe 20 billion to now only 5 to 6 billion. So recognizing and having a very good read of the context is first what is needed, because it's evolving very fast. The second thing is really set the objectives of your fiscal plan and fiscal framework. And I think given the problems of Lebanon, I think I see 4 key objectives. I mean, the first one is really the sustainability objective, fiscal and debt sustainability. How should we negotiate with creditors in order to bring that to a sustainable path, restructure the losses at the center in order to reduce these losses and have a credible monetary policy that supports the sustainability of the fiscal stance. So the sustainability objective is extremely important, and it will also inform both the effort on the revenue and on the expenditure side, because in Lebanon, obviously, we have a lot of room for maybe downsizing the public sector and reducing inefficiencies, but at the same time, we recognize that our primary expenditures as a share of GDP are actually not very high in emerging market compared to the average in the emerging market, and therefore we have to ensure that we manage this objective of sustainability through fiscal consolidation while ensuring the other objective that I want to talk about, which is equity. I mean, we need our fiscal policy to be more equitable by, as I mentioned, I mean, a more progressive revenue and tax reform But at the same, and also of course tax admin reform, but also an equity in access to service delivery, which has been a major problem of these wide inequalities. And the fiscal policy here has an important role towards that objective. A third objective that we also need to have in mind in our fiscal policy is how do we revive growth? I mean, I think if I understood in the Ukraine case, it was more expenditure-led. There were front-loaded adjustments. And in Lebanon, with a continued contraction in the economy, we have to ensure that there is the right balance between the objectives of fiscal consolidation, but also the need to have enough spending to revive and support growth, because that is also important for achieving that sustainability as we move forward. And but more importantly is what, and here is the composition of spending to support these pro-growth fiscal policy objectives. I mean, reorient our spending towards kind of the inclusive, social, maybe green type of spending through the energy sector reforms that we are going to do, but also while downsizing the public sector, invest in a very solid and performing telecom sector and digital transformation that is both beneficial to private and the public sector, and that improves service delivery and access in remote areas. And finally, of course, is the whole pillar of institutions, because the objective that we need to instill in our fiscal reform program has to be efficiency and accountability, because we need to, in order to maximize and mobilize ownership for the reform, we have to ensure that the institutions, fiscal institutions, are more accountable. Natalie just talked about the importance of fiscal transparency, of having a very transparent way of
Alia, just please, I don't know if there's a problem.
He's frozen.
Yeah, I think maybe there's a power cut or something. Shall we wait? Maybe wait just a couple of seconds. If she's not back, we'll move on and then we go back to her when she comes back. Yeah, this might take a while. Okay, there's a question Alia was just talking about the institutions, and there is a question from the audience about the oversight institution. To the both of you, Yomna and Natalie, did you rely on a institution to oversee the implementation of the reform program, or did you have to create new kind of independent oversight institutions?
We tried to increase the capacity. In Ukraine, we tried to increase the capacity of existing institutions. So through capacity improvements, there was one element that I'll call kind of in between, which is that because of the low civil service salaries, the international community did help finance special reform groups at the ministries, at key ministries that had to implement many of the reforms. And those special reform groups had higher salaries, a little bit more, a higher level of education, perhaps, and training, and were leading the reform from within the institution itself. So it wasn't a new institution that was created. It was within the Ministry of Finance or other ministries, but it was helpful.
But did you have oversight? I don't know how the institutional picture is in Ukraine. I mean, in Lebanon, for oversight, we have, for financial oversight, we have the Court of Audit, Parliament. So usually they oversee how public money is spent, raised and spent, both. So I don't know if that's what is the case in Ukraine, or
yes.
Did those national institutions oversee that the program was being rolled out as planned?
No, Those institutions would oversee, for example, spending or budgetary authority in traditional spending oversight, but there was no oversight over the reform program. To a large extent, the Ministry of Finance played that role for the government when I was in government.
Yomna, was it the case in Egypt as well?
Actually, it's very close to the case in Ukraine, because we depended on national existing institutions. There is actually this kind of a system of having special units within the key ministries, funded by some funds coming from international institutions such as the UNDP, for example, hiring new people, giving them more salaries. So we had actually the same example of managing the program. However, answering the second question regarding how the parliament, for example, or other national institutions following the implementation of the program. Yes, actually there was a very focus on following up the program every quarter, for example, from starting the president himself. So there were it was something very important for the higher policy makers to follow up on the implementation of the program. So we were preparing presentations, reports on quarterly basis to the president, to the prime minister, to the parliament, in addition to the day-to-day work regarding the budget or the budget spending or the revenues. But there was very focused from the higher policymakers regarding the implementation of the program.
Alia, sorry, you were interrupted. I think there was a power cut or something. So we just took a question from the floor, but I mean,
no problem. I apologize for no. I was just ending basically on this importance of institutions. I think the issue of efficiency and accountability, and I think just to say that the elements of any program by now in Lebanon have been actually developed a lot in outside the government than inside the government. So I think in the Lebanese society and polity, there's a lot of proposals on in bringing together these reforms. What we would need is the kind of executive decisions to put them ahead. And learn from experiences, in particular, for example, and I see there is a question, maybe I missed it, if Natalie responded to it, on the SOE reform. I mean, Lebanon has a major chantier, I mean, a major challenge in reforming its state-owned enterprises, as many are proposing, just to cover the losses in the financial sector and sell the asset, but by putting a better governance framework for these state-owned enterprises and ensuring that they become a driver of private investments through either a national a fund that better manages state-owned assets and creates a framework for exploiting these assets through PPPs or concessions or other, rather than think about this zero-sum game of selling the assets to use it to cover the losses in the financial sector. So I think it would be great to hear from Natalie some insights on the SOE reform. And I know in Egypt now they are also embarking on a big reform in this area.
Yes, please. That was the next question actually on the SOE reform. So Natalie, the floor is yours.
It was a major element of effort that was made at the time. And I think first and foremost, I would say that state management just will not work, especially in a country where rule of law and vested interests have such great capture. And so one thing we tried to do was make as much of it privatizable as possible, meaning taking it off of the lists or eliminating any barriers to privatization. So move as much to the private sector as possible. But then those that had to remain for whatever set of political or other reason in state-owned hands, tried to improve the governance of those state-owned enterprises with primarily focused on the board, bringing in a board that was capable of managing in a commercial way, using the international community to help select those board members together with the government, establishing kind of rules of the road for those new boards with independent board members to try and improve governance and develop strategy at the companies. I think that was successful for a short period of time, but we are seeing major challenges to that already 5 years later. Again, because the state hasn't really given up its desire to control. And I think that that's just, again, natural in a state that is not yet fully reformed, and then state capture still remains in place. Vested interests still control a great deal of politics and economics. When a board takes a decision that the government doesn't like, you automatically start to see the challenges where, you know, boards are challenged. Perhaps the government asks for people to be removed. There's a stepping back and forth, and Ukraine is currently in that very difficult stage where there's a disbelief right now in the international community that state-owned enterprise governance changes are having sufficient strength to stay with it. I guess in the end, it will require more than just picking people, because even having better, more independent people on your board is insufficient. You really need to start drafting strategies, which we did do for the state-owned banks, so that the board, even though it may be independent, understands where the policymakers actually desire to move with the enterprises. And I think having a strategy document and having a board that's committed to that strategy is important, because otherwise, every time a decision is taken that is not 100% agreed, the whole system starts to collapse under the weight of, well, it's still a publicly owned asset. What do you mean you're taking it in that direction? So I think it's not sufficient to have solely an independent board or a strong board. You really need to have agreed corporate strategies. And I think that the governance has to be deeper than a board alone. A board alone is challenged by a government that disagrees every time it makes a decision. So we've made some progress, but it's insufficient. And in the end, whether it's concessions or other private management, I think you need to move it out of the public management sphere entirely. I just don't believe this works. We're finding the same thing in Puerto Rico, which has rule of law. It's inefficient at a level that is harmful for all, and obviously has a major financial cost as well.
Any thoughts, Yomna, as well on the SOE, on the state-owned enterprise, the sector reform for Egypt? Maybe similar challenges or different ones?
Yes, actually, it's one of the major challenges, and it's been like 25 years where we're trying to the government to think about how to deal with the state-owned enterprises. Especially with the social component of dealing with SOEs, because there are lots of employees, there are lots of people that are working in these SOEs, and the concept of selling it to private sector or private investors had lots of question marks, especially at the beginning of the year 2000, between 2000 and 2005. And this image didn't go so. One of the major components in the reform program in Egypt in 2017 was the IPO program, and it was taken gradually. We started by selective companies in specific sectors that are doing more or less good, such as the cement sector, banking sector, and we had very good deals actually. selling lots of shares. I'm not sure it's less than 50% of shares of these companies, but there was some very good and satisfying package for this IPO program, and it's going gradually, and I think it's going to be one of the very successful programs.
Another question from the chat for the both of you as well. Did Egypt and Ukraine programs include specific steps, including the expatriate community, so the diaspora? Is this valid in your context? I mean, for Lebanon, that has a very large diaspora. We're trying to see if they can be, engaged in the recovery program. But does this apply to Egypt or Ukraine?
There was no major effort in Ukraine to benefit from the diaspora, to engage the diaspora. I myself am a member of the diaspora, so I mean, I can't say there was zero because I was named Minister of Finance, but it wasn't a programmatic approach. It wasn't I think it's actually something that still is one of the pockets of value that Ukraine has not yet developed, because that diaspora will be very capable and willing to engage and to create value, but it hasn't been fully developed, and I think that's an area for growth.
Yeah, and this is, of course, is invalid in the context of Egypt. Yeah.
Okay, we're trying to run a bit out of time, so I won't be long. Maybe my last question, unless somebody has another. My last question to you would be, if we had to conclude with each one of you giving like one recommendation for Lebanon on where to start or what to prioritize based on your experiences, what would that be? Though I know there's plenty of things to be done. Alia just mentioned that everyday priorities are changing, but I mean, based on your own experience, what is like the most important thing you would give a country in crisis as recommendation?
I guess I won't come with a policy, a specific policy, but I would say for everyone to sit down and consider what would create or what would enable public confidence to be restored. In Ukraine's situation, it was banking reform. But I would suggest to identify the single thing. I don't know Lebanon well enough to suggest what it might be, but the single kind of fiscal monetary core element that could start to restore public confidence and to build a program based on rebuilding public confidence. Of course, doing all the other things, but make at the core something that people will buy into and will support and will see the benefit of, while they unfortunately pay, for example, the cost of other potential reforms or other painful things that occur with reform that take longer to appreciate. But there needs to be something at the very core that you can say that you've done to improve their lives. If it's currency stability, in our case, maybe banking deposits, those two work together. Find that piece that the population can understand, support, and in doing so, then support the rest of the reform program.
Actually, I'm not going to specify a certain reform on the fiscal side or the economic side, but I think this time, specifically this time, the program succeeded because of how transparent the government was with the public. Because every time we have, for example, we embark on the energy reform subsidies, it's kind of surprise for the people, and we start have some rising voices from the public, and the reform is interrupted. So we didn't invent the wheel. We knew from several years that these are the reforms that we need to have a recovery plan. But this time, the only thing that has been changed is that it was announced clearly to the public, 5 years reform plan, what are we going to do and when we are going to do it. And people were engaged from the very first beginning. And I think that was the key for the success.
Thanks. Alia?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree very much with what Natalie said, and because in the case of Lebanon, I think the single most important thing to restore confidence at this stage, and they are very quite related, is the restructuring of the banking system, and the which is of course linked to the reform of the monetary and exchange rate system. The focus on these is essential also, and not only to ensure that there is a better distribution of the losses, without which I think every citizen will feel that they have lost a lot and they need to do more sacrifices in the future. But as we do that, I think creating a much better regulatory framework for better corporate governance of the financial sector, not after basically what Lebanon has become famous with, a Ponzi scheme that's stolen, or that has dissipated or destroyed the savings of millions of people. And I think it's extremely important to approach the banking resolution framework also with a having in mind a revamping of the regulatory and institutional and corporate governance framework of the sector.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It was, I think I can speak on behalf of the audience. I would allow myself to say that, to thank you and for sharing a wealth of information today. I've personally learned a lot. It was very informative. Few of the things I've retained, but there were so many things that, of course, tough decisions are required, but coordinated action is can make it happen. That any fiscal package or policy response would go hand in hand with a social response to protect the most vulnerable and to always provide people with hope that things will improve eventually. The importance Alia just mentioned of the regulatory, of improving the regulatory and governance framework, to anchor the fiscal response into a broader set of response, of course, and that crises are opportunities sometimes to renew our hope in a better country and in better services. Thanks to the three of you again for being that, I mean, very frank talk and very informative talk. Lots of insight. Thank you. In the chat, there was also, discussions going on in the chat. I tried to cover everything. I'm not sure I did, but I mean, I tried to cover what is going on in the chat as well. Allow me also to thank Benoit, our colleague Benoit from the IMF Method, because he put us in contact with you, and that was, I mean, very, he thought, I mean, he understood what we needed, and he put us in contact with the right people. So thanks for that. Thanks for the team also that is, you're not seeing maybe, but my colleagues who are helping out with setting up all this, this talk. Thanks a lot. I do hope we will keep in touch and that we'll have many opportunities to discuss how our countries will progress. So thank you. Thanks again for accepting our invitation today.
Thank you very much.
If anyone would like to add anything.
Thank you so much. Excellent talk. Thank you.
Thanks.